The Kelhari died on a Tuesday. Not that the Kelhari had ever used that word. Tuesday was a human construct, a small inherited piece of a 7-day week born on a single blue planet at the edge of the outer spiral. But it was a Tuesday by Earth's reckoning when the Volkai Dominion's annihilation fleet entered the Kelhari home system, and it was a Tuesday, 6 hours and 41 minutes later, when the thermal signatures of 7 billion lives simply stopped appearing on the Conclave's long-range sensors. 7 billion. Ambassador Sira Voss had been in the middle of eating breakfast when the alert came through. She didn't finish it. She walked the long corridor from her quarters to the Conclave's emergency chamber on Ethon Station, and she counted her own footsteps the whole way, because she needed something small and countable to hold on to, while the number 7 billion tried to find a place to settle inside her chest. The chamber was already full when she arrived. 17 species. 17 flags projected in holographic light above 17 chairs arranged in the Conclave's traditional circle, a shape meant to suggest equality, though Voss had long since learned which seats held the real gravity in any room. The Thal delegation sat stone still, their bioluminescent frills dark and flat. The Orani had already sent their secondary representative, which meant the primary had quietly excused himself to begin whatever the Orani did when a war got too close to their shipping lanes. The Jeshari High Arbiter was speaking when Voss took her seat, his 4 hands moving through the formal signing patterns that accompanied diplomatic speech, his words careful and long and shaped entirely around the concept of strategic patience. It was, Voss reflected, a remarkable phrase for what was, in plain language, retreat. The vote took 4 hours. It should have taken 4 minutes. Everyone in that room already knew what they were going to do. They had been doing it for 40 years, seeding system after system, using words like reposition and consolidate and preserve remaining assets to describe the slow, dignified act of running from something that had never once been stopped. The Ardennes corridor would be seeded. The resolution passed 14-3. Humanity, the Jeshari, and the Thal voted against. It changed nothing. Voss walked out of the chamber without speaking. In the corridor, the surviving Kelhari attaché, a young male named Sarek, who had been off-world on a diplomatic posting when his planet was erased, fell into step beside her. He didn't say anything either. After a while, he reached out and put one of his slender 6-fingered hands on her arm. She didn't pull away. She sent one message before she reached the communications bay. It was brief, and it went to Earth Command on a Priority 1 military channel, bypassing the Conclave's shared network entirely. Hold the corridor. 3 words, the most consequential 3 words Sira Voss would ever transmit. At the time, she wasn't certain anyone would obey them. She wasn't even certain she had the authority to send them. 6 hours later, the TSNS Endurance, a Dominion-class battlecruiser, 14 years old, showing wear on her port thruster arrays, currently on standard patrol at the mouth of the Ardennes corridor, received the order. Captain Alara Mwangi read it once, handed the data slate back to her communications officer, and said simply, "All stop. Hold position." The communications officer, Ensign Tomas Reyes, 23 years old and 6 months into his first deep space posting, looked up from his console. Through the viewport ahead of them, the Ardennes corridor stretched into the dark, a narrow channel between twin magnetar fields that was, for all practical purposes, the only navigable approach to the inner conclave systems from the outer spiral. It was, by any strategic measure, the door to everything. "Captain," Reyes said carefully, "the conclave order is to stand down." "I know," said Mwangi. "The Volkai fleet is 46 hours out." "I know." Reyes looked back at his console. After a moment he said, very quietly, "Good." Outside, the Endurance held position. The magnetar fields pulsed on either side, slow and indifferent, as they had for 1 billion years before any of this began. The stars didn't move. Nothing moved. Except the Volkai. They were always moving. The Volkai didn't attack first. They never had. This was one of the things the conclave's military analysts had always found difficult to explain to civilian populations. The Dominion was not, by any clinical definition, a force of pure destruction. They were methodical. They were, in their own way, almost bureaucratic. Before every conquest, they sent a herald. The herald ship that entered the outer edge of the Ardennes corridor on the 40th hour was enormous, longer than the Endurance by a factor of 6, its hull a flat, absolute black that seemed to drink the light around it. But it was not the size that made every person on the Endurance's bridge go quiet when it appeared on their screens. It was what covered its hull. Beacon transponders, thousands of them, each one broadcasting on a distinct frequency, each frequency corresponding to a warship registration in the Galactic Conclave's central military database. Every ship that had ever tried to stop the Volkai, every captain who had ever given an order to hold a line, every crew that had ever powered weapons and turned to face the dark. They were all there, broadcasting their names, still transmitting from the hull of the ship that had outlasted them. Lieutenant Commander Priya Adami, the Endurance's tactical officer, ran the database match in silence. When it was complete, she didn't read the results aloud. She just turned to Captain Mwangi and held up the slate, and the number at the bottom of the list, 2,847 individual vessel registrations, said everything that needed to be said. Then the herald transmitted. Admiral Prime Saruthex of the Volkai Dominion had a voice that the Endurance's translation matrix rendered as deep, layered, almost harmonic, like several voices that had agreed to speak as one. The message was short. It was a list, read in full, of every civilization the Dominion had absorbed. 17 names. Then the coordinates where their orbital infrastructure could still be found, slowly cooling. Then one sentence, which the translation matrix rendered with a precision that Saruthex almost certainly intended. Place your vessel's identification beacon on our hull, and your people will be remembered as the others are remembered. The bridge was silent for 4 full seconds. Then Captain Mwangi turned to Ensign Reyes and said, "Open a response channel." Reyes opened it. Mwangi didn't speak. Instead, she nodded to Petty Officer Danielle Akafer at the ship systems console, and Akafer pulled up a file she had clearly already prepared. Because Akafer had been on this ship for 11 years and she knew her captain, and routed it through the open channel. Music, something very old. A trumpet, slow and warm and entirely unconcerned with the laws of the galaxy. A man's voice, rough at the edges, singing about the world as though he had personally negotiated the terms of it and found them acceptable. Louis Armstrong, What a Wonderful World, recorded in New York City, Earth, in 1967, transmitted across the Ardennes corridor in 2387 to the hull of the most feared warship in the known galaxy. Saruthex did not respond for 11 minutes. When he did, the message was a single word, routed not through the diplomatic channel, but through the Dominion's internal tactical network. A channel the Endurance was not supposed to be able to intercept, but which Lieutenant Adami had been quietly monitoring for 6 hours. The word translated meant something close to interesting. On the Endurance, no one laughed, but 2 or 3 people smiled, and that was enough. Mwangi watched her crew, 847 men and women, every one of them fully aware of what was 46 light minutes behind that herald ship, and felt something she would later struggle to name. Not bravery exactly, not defiance, something quieter, the particular stillness of people who have made a decision and are no longer afraid of it. She called a senior staff briefing for 600. There was a great deal of work to do. In the conclave chamber, a feed of the Endurance's position was still active on the tactical display, a single green dot, motionless, at the corridor's mouth. Ambassador Voss stood before it for a long time. Behind her, Sorik the Kelhari attaché watched the dot and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the dot was not already saying. It was still there. They came at 3:40 ship time, because the Volkai had learned from 40 years of conquest That species with circadian rhythms were slowest in the hours before their dawn. They didn't know that Captain Mwangi had put her crew on a reverse sleep schedule 72 hours earlier. The forward screen of the Endurance lit white as the Valkyrie advance fleet dropped out of FTL-43 warships, ranging from destroyer class to the 3 dreadnoughts at the formation's core, arranged in a compression wedge designed to fill the corridor from edge to edge and leave nothing with room to maneuver. It was a formation that had ended civilizations. Mwangi had spent 31 hours studying it. "Helm," she said, "take us into the shoals." The Endurance moved not away from the fleet, but sideways, cutting hard to port into the dense magnetic interference bands that ran along the corridor's northern edge. Every other species in the conclave flew away from magnetar shoals. The navigational interference they generated could blind sensors, disrupt targeting systems, and play havoc with shield harmonics. The Valkyrie's tactical database marked them as impassable. Lieutenant Commander Adami had spent those same 31 hours recalibrating the Endurance's sensor array to read through interference bands that the ship was never designed to navigate. It was not, strictly speaking, possible. She had done it anyway. The first Valkyrie destroyer came around the shoal's inner edge at full combat speed, its weapons already charged, expecting to find the human ship running. It found instead a battlecruiser sitting completely still, every weapon bearing, waiting at a range so close that the shot was more or less a formality. The destroyer died in 4 seconds. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a chase that Mwangi controlled entirely, because she had chosen the terrain and the Valkyrie had not. She pulled ships into the shoals one at a time, or in pairs, denied them the space to use their numbers, and made the 43 feel like 12. The Endurance fired and jumped micro-distances, 50 kilometers, 100, using the shoal's own electromagnetic chaos to mask the jump signatures, reappearing somewhere the Valkyrie's predictive targeting hadn't expected. 8 hours, 12 Valkyrie vessels crippled or destroyed, the advance fleet pulled back. But the Endurance paid for every hour. Deck 7 was gone. A focused plasma lance had cut through the hull at 5:17, and 22 people had been there. Chief Engineer Rosa Kama lost her left arm to a secondary explosion and kept working, directing her team through a voice comm clipped to her collar, her right hand on a manual pressure seal. Lieutenant Adami took a head wound from a console that detonated when a near miss rattled the ship's spine, and she ran the tactical board for 3 more hours with a field dressing over one eye before the medical team pulled her off. At 11:43, when the Valkyrie fleet broke off and pulled back to regroup, Mwangi walked the ship herself. She walked every corridor she could reach. She looked at the sealed doors where the atmo barriers had engaged, the burn marks on the walls, the places where her crew had made the ship work with their hands when its systems failed. She looked at her people, exhausted, injured, some of them so young she still found it startling, and she found them all still at their stations. She walked back to the bridge and sat down. "Damage report," she said. "Significant," said Kamal's voice from engineering, rough and dry as gravel. "But she's still flying, Captain." "Then so are we," said Mwangi. "Prep for the next wave." Sorathex had destroyed 17 civilizations. He had received their final transmissions, their pleas, their defiance, their silence. He had studied their military doctrine, their weapon systems, their formations. He understood war the way a mathematician understands equations, completely, structurally, without surprise. He had never sent a second message to an enemy after the Herald. He sent one now. It was routed through the diplomatic channel, which meant it was technically a formal communication, something that could be recorded, cited, archived. The Valkyrie High Command would have preferred he not do it. He did it anyway because 40 years of conquest had not prepared him for the question that was eating at him, and Sorathex, whatever else he was, had never been comfortable with questions he couldn't answer. The message was simple: why have you not retreated? Not a taunt, not a negotiation, A genuine question, asked by a commander who had watched one ship absorb 12 hours of assault and was still, impossibly, sitting in the same place it had started. Mwangi read the message and handed it to Lieutenant Ape, the Endurance's science and intelligence officer. Deo Ape was 31 years old, had a doctorate in xenosociology from the University of Lagos, and had been composing his response in his head since the moment the herald appeared on their screens, because he was the kind of person who was always 3 steps ahead of the conversation. He spent 4 hours on it, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted to say it correctly. He sent a file, not a message, a file. A compiled archive, cross-referenced and annotated, of 430 years of human military history, focused specifically on one recurring phenomenon: the humans who did not retreat. Thermopylae, 480 BC. 300 Spartans and several thousand allies against a Persian force historians estimated at over 100,000. They held for 3 days. The pass was lost, but Greece was not. Rorke's Drift, 1879. 140 British soldiers against 3,000 to 4,000 Zulu warriors. They held through the night. Every surviving defender was decorated. The action became something the British carried with them for a century, not as evidence of superiority, but as evidence of what a small number of people could make themselves do. Stalingrad, 1942. A city that became a concept. Soldiers who crossed the Volga under fire because the order was to hold the city, and they held it, building by building, room by room, for 200 days in a winter that killed men as efficiently as bullets. The force that entered Russia was never the same again. The Chasen Reservoir, 1950. The Ayadrang Valley, 1965. Wanat, 2008. Kamdesh, 2009. The Defense of Port Stanley, 1982. The Battle of Debrecen, 2061. The I.O. Station Siege, 2198. Entry after entry after entry, stretching across 4 centuries and a dozen different wars, each one a variation on the same theme. Humans, outnumbered and outgunned, who simply decided that the place where they stood was the place where they would remain. Ape included one final annotation at the end. It read, "We are not unusual in this respect. We are consistent. There is a difference." The file was received on the Herald ship at 1630. Sorothex read it for 6 hours. Then he called his tactical staff together and, for the first time in the Dominion's military history, requested a full structural analysis of a single enemy vessel, not its weapons, not its shields, but its crew. On Ethon Station, 3 conclave species received the same transmission that Sorothex had sent, intercepted by the Endurance's intelligence systems and forwarded by Ape, who believed in transparency when it served a purpose. The Thal delegation read the file Ape sent in response. Their High Admiral, a female named Itha Sorin, read it twice. Then she went to her private quarters and sat alone with it for a long time, and when she came out, she sent a message to her government that would take 3 days to produce a formal reply, but which she already knew the answer to. The Ardennes corridor was not, she had decided, the place to let a 24-year-old ensign and a one-armed engineer run out of ammunition alone. Day 4. The Endurance had, at this point, been under siege for 91 hours. The Volkai had probed the corridor 6 times since the initial engagement, never committing their full force again, testing the ship's responses, mapping her patterns, trying to find the edge of what one human battlecruiser could absorb. They hadn't found it yet, but it was getting close. Half of the primary weapon systems were running on bypass circuits that Chief Kamal had soldered personally, working one-handed in a pressure suit in a compartment with no internal atmosphere. The forward shields were cycling at 60% efficiency, because the emitter array on the bow had taken a direct hit in the 4th probe, and the replacement parts required a spacewalk that had lasted 4 hours in active combat conditions. Petty Officer Akaffer had done the spacewalk. She hadn't said much about it afterwards. 41 people were dead. Another 90 were in the medical bay, and the medical bay was operating beyond capacity, which meant the corridors outside it had become part of the medical bay. Mwangi walked the ship every day. The crew needed to see her. She needed to see them. She didn't make speeches. She stopped and talked to people individually, asked names she already knew, asked about injuries she'd already been briefed on, asked what they needed and listened to the answers. She wrote a personal log every morning at 500 before anyone else was awake, sitting in the small observation alcove off the bridge. On day 4, the log read, Garcia's team fixed the port thruster array using parts from a console that wasn't load-bearing. Reyes hasn't slept more than 4 hours in 2 days, but I can't make him leave the comm station because nobody else is reading the Volkai frequency harmonics the way he is. Adami is running tactical with one eye. Kamau is running engineering with one arm. I have 847 people on this ship, and I honestly don't know who any of them were before this week, but I know exactly who they are now. I'm not angry. I want the record to show that. I'm not angry, and I'm not afraid, and I'm not waiting for someone to come and tell us we've done enough. I'm just not moving. Back on Ethon Station, the conclave chamber had stopped pretending to discuss other matters. The single green dot of the Endurance on the tactical display had become the only thing anyone looked at. The Orani primary representative had returned. The shipping lanes, it turned out, were on the other side of the Ardennes corridor, and it had occurred to him that this was relevant. The Jeshari High Arbiter had stopped using the phrase strategic patience entirely, which was noted, because the Jeshari had been using that phrase for 38 years. In a private chamber off the main floor, Ambassador Voss received a communication from Earth Command. Admiral Yusuf Park's face was calm in the way that people are calm when they are doing something irreversible. We're moving the 7th carrier group, Park said. Voss felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was held tight. The conclave won't authorize. They don't need to, Park said. The Endurance is a human vessel. Human vessels are our jurisdiction. We're going to where our ship is. Voss nodded once. Who volunteered? Park almost smiled. Everyone, Ambassador. We had to turn people away. The transmission ended. Voss walked back into the conclave chamber, took her seat, and looked at the green dot on the display. Around her, 15 species who had been retreating for 40 years looked at it too, and something was shifting in that room, something slow and tidal and ancient, the way the mood of a crowd shifts when one person, somewhere at the back, decides to stop walking in the same direction as everyone else. They dropped out of FTL at 2:20, and the Volkai fleet saw them before the conclave did. 7 vessels. Not the most powerful ships in the human fleet. Earth Command had sent what was available, what was close, what could make the jump in time. 2 carrier-class ships, the TSNS Meridian and the TSNS Cape Fear, 3 escort destroyers, 1 mobile repair platform, unarmed, enormous, crewed by engineers who had spent the last 4 days modifying every system they could think of on the journey over. And at the formation center, running slightly ahead of the rest because her captain had pushed the drives past recommended tolerance for the final 8 hours of the journey, the frigate TSNS Harriet Tubman, whose name Ensign Reyes saw on the IFF readout and had to take a breath before he could read aloud. Captain Mwangi heard the report and felt something she recognized from her early career, from a memory of being a lieutenant on a different ship in a different crisis, when reinforcements had arrived 20 minutes before the kind of ending that doesn't get written up. Relief was the wrong word for it. It was heavier than relief. It was the physical sensation of a weight that you had been holding alone being transferred to more hands. But that was not the most significant thing that happened in the next 4 hours. Lieutenant Ape had spent the last 31 hours between tactical shifts, between damage reports, in every spare 20 minutes he could find working on something else. He had been studying the Ardennes Corridor's navigational relay network, the system of automated beacons and FTL coordinate transponders that guided ships safely through the Magnetar shoals. Every ship that used the corridor relied on those relays, including the Volkai. The Volkai's jump coordination, the system that allowed 43 ships to drop out of FTL in formation, in the right place, at the right time, depended on reading those relay signals and using them to synchronize. It was elegant, efficient, and completely standard across every spacefaring species in the conclave. It had never occurred to anyone that the relays could be reprogrammed. HFY had reprogrammed them. The modification was subtle, not a shutdown, which the Volkai would detect and compensate for, but a drift. A very small, very consistent error introduced into the coordinate data, calibrated to compound over multiple jumps, designed to make the Volkai fleet's formation integrity degrade every time they tried to jump in together. He briefed Mwangi on it at 3:40. She looked at him for a long moment. "When did you sleep last?" "I'll sleep after," he said. "How confident are you?" 83% it works. 91% they don't notice it until the third jump. He paused. 100% I did the math right. Mwangi authorized it. At 5:17, the Endurance transmitted the modified relay protocols through the corridor's network. By 600, every navigational beacon in the Ardennes corridor was feeding the Volkai fleet coordinates that were correct in all ways that could be casually verified and wrong in exactly one way that could not. In the conclave chamber, the single green dot on the tactical display was now accompanied by 7 more. The Thal High Admiral's reply to her government had come back. 3 Thal warships were already en route. The Orani confirmed 2. The Jeshari High Arbiter, who had, it turned out, been quietly arguing for intervention in private sessions for 6 days while maintaining the public position of strategic patience, submitted a formal declaration to the chamber floor that was, in plain language, a declaration of war. The chamber was very quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet at all. The Volkai came with everything. Sarathex had requested his full assault fleet, 112 ships, including the Herald and the 3 dreadnoughts and 6 additional capital-class vessels that had been held in reserve since the Kalahari campaign. It was, by any measure, the largest single force the Dominion had ever committed to a single engagement. He had not done this in 40 years of conquest. He had never needed to. He needed to now, and he knew what that meant, and he launched the assault anyway, because the alternative was to leave one human ship in one corridor and go back to the Dominion's core worlds and explain what had happened. And Sarathex was a commander who understood that there are defeats more permanent than the tactical kind. They dropped out of FTL at 300, and the formation was off by 4 degrees. It shouldn't have mattered. 4 degrees of formation drift in a fleet this size was within normal parameters, correctable in seconds. Except the relay drift HFY had introduced compounded on re-entry, and the correction burned the fleet's navigation systems automatically triggered put 3 of the capital ships into a crossing pattern with the dreadnought formation, and in the 3 minutes it took to sort that out, the Endurance and the 7 human ships were already moving. Mwangi had positioned her ship at the exact geometric center of the corridor's choke point, not hidden, not running, exactly where she had been for 97 hours. The carrier groups had fanned out behind her in an echelon formation that the Endurance's tactical systems had calculated across 3 days of watching Volkai attack patterns. And behind the human ships, quiet, unannounced, appearing on the Endurance's IFF readout in a column that made Rays count them twice. 5 Thal warships, 2 Orani, and the 3 Jeshari vessels that the High Arbiter had personally ordered to the corridor without waiting for a full conclave vote. 10 alien warships, species that had been retreating for 40 years, species whose governments had cast 16 different votes in 3 days and were still arguing in chambers while their ships were already here. Mwangi looked at the display and said nothing for a moment. Then she opened the fleet-wide channel. "All ships, this is Captain Mwangi. You know where we are, you know why we're here. Let's make sure they understand both." The battle lasted 11 hours and 4 minutes. The Volkai's numerical advantage was real, and it mattered. The Allied force lost 4 ships. The Endurance took damage that the repair platform later assessed as total loss equivalent. She was held together by Camo's engineering team, and what Ake would later describe in his after-action report as organizational stubbornness operating at the molecular level. Mwangi was knocked off her feet twice by impact concussions and returned to the command chair both times before the shockwave finished echoing. But the relay drift meant the Volkai never fully recovered their formation integrity. Every time they tried to jump to a new attack vector, they arrived slightly wrong, not wrong enough to be catastrophic, but wrong enough to matter, wrong enough to cost them the 3-second windows in which battles are won and lost. Ape sat at his console and watched his math work in real time, and felt something he would later describe to his family as the most frightening and satisfying experience of his life. At 1404, Sarathex ordered a fighting retreat. No Volkai fleet had ever retreated. The message he transmitted back to the Dominion's core worlds was flagged, archived, analyzed, and argued over in Dominion command councils for the next decade. It was 11 words in Volkai, which translated into something like, "We have encountered a variable we did not include in our model." The Ardennes corridor was silent by 1500. The Allied fleet held position. No one cheered, not immediately, not spontaneously, the way it happens in stories. What happened was that people sat down. They sat down at their stations and they breathed, and some of them put their heads in their hands, and some of them said nothing, and some of them said names. Mwangi sat in her command chair and looked at the corridor ahead of her, clear, open, running into the dark, and she thought about Deck 7, and about the 22 people who had been there, and about the 41 others whose names she had committed to memory because she felt it was the least and most she could do. She didn't cry. She didn't speak for a long time. When she did speak, she said, "Get me a damage report and a casualty list, and someone find out if Camo has eaten anything today." Endurance did not fly home. She was towed. The mobile repair platform docked with her 6 hours after the Volkai withdrawal, and the engineers aboard, who had watched the entire battle on their sensors with the helpless intensity of people who could only help once the shooting stopped, went to work immediately. They worked for 19 days, and what they produced was not a complete repair so much as a careful argument that the ship was still technically one object. Captain Mwangi stayed aboard throughout. She was offered transport to Ethon Station multiple times for the Conclave's formal session, for the Earth Command debrief, for the ceremony that Earth's Parliament was already organizing. She declined all of them. She told Admiral Park that she would attend the debrief when her crew were stable, her dead were accounted for, and her ship could move under her own power. It took 23 days. When the Endurance finally limped into Ethon Station under reduced thrust, every ship in the docking area had cleared space for her. The Thal fleet, 7 vessels by this point, their government having ultimately committed a full squadron, was moored along the station's eastern array. Their crews lined the viewing galleries of their ships in full dress uniform as the Endurance passed. Mwangi saw it on the external cameras and did not know, at first, what she was seeing, because the gesture was from Thal military tradition, the formal acknowledgement given to a force that had held ground you would have abandoned. She stood at the viewport for a long time. In the conclave chamber, the session that followed was unlike any in the body's 200-year history. The Jeshari High Arbiter introduced the mutual defense resolution that he had been quietly drafting for 6 days. It passed 17-0, unanimous, the first unanimous resolution the conclave had passed since its founding charter. The resolution was formally titled the Ardennes Accord. Within a week, everyone was calling it the Endurance Covenant. Ambassador Voss gave a statement to the chamber. It was brief. She had always believed that the shorter a statement was, the more confidence it indicated. She said that humanity had not held the corridor to prove a point, had not held it out of recklessness, and had not held it as an act of heroism, though others were welcome to call it that. "We held it," she said, "because it needed to be held and we were there." Lieutenant Ake published his navigational relay modification in the Conclave's Open Technical Archive 3 months after the battle, unclassified, available to every member species, translated into all 17 official Conclave languages. He included a note at the beginning of the paper that said, "The mathematics of this system are not complicated. We encourage all member species to study them. We will teach anyone who asks." Within a year, the modification had been adopted as a standard defensive protocol across the Conclave's entire navigational network. Sorik, the Kelhari attaché, was offered Conclave observer status for the species whose world no longer existed. He accepted it on behalf of the 4,000 Kelhari who had been off-world when the Dominion came. He would spend the next 12 years advocating for a Kelhari resettlement colony, and he would succeed. He kept on his desk a copy of the Louis Armstrong transmission, not the music file, but the record that it had been sent, the timestamp, the channel, the context. He showed it to people sometimes. He never explained why. He didn't feel he needed to. The Volkai did not return for 19 years. When they came back, they came to negotiate. The Dominion's internal debates about the Ardennes engagement, about the relay drift, about the crew casualty reports, about the file Ake had sent Sorothex, had been complex and long and conducted at the highest levels of their command structure. The conclusion they reached was not that humanity was unbeatable. It was something more precise than that. They had concluded that humanity was incalculable. That the variable of human persistence did not behave like other variables. That you could model their weapons and their ships and their formations, and you would be accurate, and it would not matter, because somewhere in the model was a crew that had been told to retreat and had not, and you could not put a number on that. They came to negotiate. Mwangi was not at the negotiating table. She had retired 2 years prior, having been offered admiralty 3 times and declined each time. She was teaching at the Earth Command Academy in Nairobi, a course in operational strategy, which the cadets described among themselves as the most demanding course in the curriculum, and which had a waiting list. On the day the Volkai negotiators arrived at Ethon Station, a cadet in Mwangi's morning class asked her how it felt. She had known the question was coming. She had been asked versions of it for 17 years. She thought about Deck 7. She thought about Kamau soldering with one hand. She thought about Reyes at his console at 3:40, whispering good. She thought about 41 names she still said to herself sometimes in the early mornings before anyone else was awake. It felt, she said carefully, like doing what needed to be done in the place where you happened to be at the time when it was needed. She paused. That's all any of it ever is. The cadets wrote it down. Outside, the stars were the same stars they had always been, indifferent, ancient, scattered across a dark that had seen empires rise and fall and would see more. And somewhere in that dark, at the mouth of a corridor between 2 magnetar fields, the space where the Endurance had held position was just space now. Empty, quiet, ordinary. Except that it wasn't. It never would be again. Some places become what happened in them. Some lines, once held, change the shape of everything that comes after. This was one of those lines. The Endurance had seen to that.